Hey there! Welcome to Dirt Rich, seasonal conversations on food and farming. I'm Katie Federal, and at the heart of today's conversation is the third principle of soil health, increasing crop or plant diversity. Doug Voss and Kent Solberg, two members of SFA's soil health team and farmers themselves, are back to consider the value of plant diversity in their own pastures and the exponential environmental and animal performance benefits that they see. They've got a little advice on a few different methods for building diversity in your own pastures, so let's get to it. Hi again, Kent and Doug.
Hi, Katie.
Hello.
So we got increasing crop diversity as one of SFA's 5 principles of soil health. What does that look like in your pastures?
Well, we're striving to get as much plant diversity in our pastures as possible. We think that benefits the animals. We think it benefits soil microbes, just the function of the whole system. If we look at native prairie systems and even just most of our native plant communities across North America historically, they were highly diverse. They were highly functional. They were cycling nutrients. They were able to handle water. They were able to withstand drought. Estimates on the number of prairie plants out there were anywhere from 160 to 200 plants on many, many patches of prairie. It included all the plant functional groups, which is grasses, forbs or broadleaves, and legumes. Each of those playing a different but vital and important role in that. And so we're trying to mimic that on our pastures as much as possible, not only through planting, but even more importantly, by stimulating the latent seed bank through grazing management. In other words, creating those environmental conditions in the soil that allow those seeds that have been lying there dormant for many, 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 many years an opportunity to germinate and express themselves and adding to the diversity of our pastures.
So when we look at diversity, we think of it as a good thing. And in this situation, I'd like to say that there's an exception to the rule that you can't have too much of a good thing. I don't know that you can have too much diversity in your pastures. And with the question, Katie, that you asked, what does it look like in our pastures? I'll tell you more what I would like it to look like, because again, we have to remind ourselves that we're working with a degraded system. And so management in the past has put us to where we are today, or at least it's had an effect on it. And so in our pastures, we're striving to have more diversity. And that diversity is not only diversity at one time, but diversity over a season or even multiple seasons. And like Kent said, when we're looking at managing for diversity and we're using our rest periods with our cattle, our livestock impacts on those places, that we can tap into that latent seed bank. And some of those things don't necessarily have to always persist once they're established. If they're going to be something that's going to fit the conditions that that season has to offer, that's all right. But we want to look, jungle-like out there. We want diversity of low plants, of high plants, and everything in between. We want a vast array of solar collectors out there doing their part to harvest that sunlight and the microbes in the soil, converting that, raw material, that geology, to a plant storable form and available for our livestock so they can thrive.
Yeah, can you tell me a bit more about what crop diversity does for the grazing animals? How does it help them thrive?
So our livestock, when they're out grazing, they're going to bulk up on maybe just a few different species out there. But work from Dr. Fred Prevents and others has demonstrated that our grazing animals, if given the opportunity, in any given day will select from 30 to even up to 75 different plants. Now, they might just take a little bite of this or a little bite of that. Why would they do that? Well, what they're after are the phytochemicals or the photosynthetic produced chemicals that individual plant species have, some more than others. Some have more tannins, some have more alkaloids, and animals need some of each of these. We've built most of our livestock rations around a mean or an average, and yet if we look at scatter plots of where different things are around an average, very few of those organisms hit land on the mean. They're on one side or the other, but the bulk of them are centered in or around the mean. Or many of us are familiar with the bell-shaped curve, and that's where that comes from. But not everybody's at the same place at the same time. You might have animals at different stage of lactation, different stages of gestation, just like people. Some days we're a bit more on our game, and some days we're a bit off our game. We're not feeling so well on a given day. Maybe we need more vitamin A or more vitamin D or more vitamin C or more zinc or more boron or whatever in our diet. Animals are the same, but they have basically a feedback mechanism in their digestive system and going back to their brain that help them pick some of this out and select for that. And it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And some of that carries over into human nutrition. We're told to eat a diverse diet, lots of different uh, everything from nuts and berries, fruits and vegetables, proteins, carbohydrates in our diet. We're supposed to mix it up. We're not just supposed to eat Doritos every day, for example. So that's not very good for us. And we shouldn't be feeding our livestock that, because they're all at a different point. And so by by having that diversity out there, giving them the opportunity to select, we find that our animal performance goes up, our animal health goes up. We have a lot less problems. And not to put veterinarians out of business, but we see the whole veterinarian, our local veterinarian, a whole lot less. Some people haven't seen a veterinarian on their farm for years when they focused on plant diversity and allowing these animals to select. A lot of problems we hear about in grazing situations go away when we have plant diversity out there. Plants that are considered to be very toxic for livestock can still exist in our pasture, and yes, they may eat a little of it now and again, but that shouldn't hurt them if that wide array of stuff is out there and available for them to eat.
So the diversity thing really comes into what we refer to epigenetic effect. And so the ability of the animal to self-medicate with some of these different species that can only be done if those species are available to that animal. Um, Take care of any parasite issues they have. They can actually do that with certain plant species. And just the importance of having the availability of that vast array of diverse plants for our livestock can't hardly be overstated. And the thing is that all these different things like the tannins that Kent referred to, and these phytochemicals, these complex compounds that are available in some of these plants that we very often wouldn't even consider them very desirable if we would want to select for what we want to see in our pastures. But to have those things out there allows that animal to select it when it needs it and at the right amounts it needs it, because these things change. For example, if you take a tea plant and you start to take and remove tea leaves from that tea plant will respond and it will actually put a bitterness in the leaves so that whatever is harvesting or eating that plant won't overeat to the point where that plant will suffer and die. And so those levels vary. And quite honestly, with as much as work as we're putting into understanding animal nutrition, if we would put the same kind of effort into understanding the importance of diversity in our pastures, we would be likely much further down the road in less time, because that animal is going to have the sense to detect and harvest what it needs at the time if we're allowed. Now that's maybe going to be the exception if that historically the animal hasn't had adequate diversity available to them. They could overdose on something or other. Could it be serious? Yes, it could be serious. But that just puts more weight and value to the ability of that animal to select its diet from the diversity that we're after.
Similarly, what does crop diversity do for the environment and for your land?
So when we have plant diversity out there, we want to see examples in all the different plant functional groups: grasses, both warm and cool season, legumes or nitrogen fixers, and forbs, or what some people call broadleaves. Those functional groups and the wide array of diversity are important for stimulating diversity in the soil microbe populations. For example, mycorrhizal fungi, just super important from a soil health standpoint, for building soil aggregation and for even mining nutrients from the parent material or from rocks, if you will, the geology, and making that not only plant but even livestock and human available from a nutritional standpoint. There are mycorrhizal fungi are tied to only certain species. So certain species of mycorrhizal fungi have an association with only certain plant species. The more diversity we have out there, the more resiliency we build. And it's not a linear impact, it's an exponential impact. And so this higher level of diversity gives us exponentially greater environmental benefits. When we build soil aggregate structure, we now build the ability to handle heavy rainfall events. We build both macro and micro pores, those micro pores holding much tighter water in the soil, but also making it more available during extended periods of drought to the plant. Just absolutely critical. The ability to handle trafficability, even from our livestock, so they're not tearing up a site if it's a little too wet. It has a spongy nature to it and not a brick that turns slimy when it gets water on it. So our animals can traverse it with a lot less potential for damage out there. In turn, what does this mean? It means better water quality downstream. It means better water quality in your surface water for your animals. It means better water quality in your own farm well that's out there. Huge environmental impacts just from that alone. We're cycling nutrients better. We're not having runoffs of phosphorus and nitrogen into our water, seeping into our water system. It's being tied up. And so as we build diversity, we're building all this in. As nutrients are cycling correctly, we have less quote unquote weed problems out there than we would if we weren't cycling nutrients correctly. And so there's just a host of benefits that spin off into, as we were talking about earlier, livestock performance. And that positive livestock performance creates a better food product for us as humans, whether that's meat, milk, or eggs. For us, it's going to be much more nutrient dense food. There's some really good documentation coming out on everything from balancing fatty acid levels to just micronutrient levels inside of those foods coming from highly diverse systems.
If there's a nutshell to take away with diversity is looking at the parallelism. If you enhance diversity and you can focus on that exponential effect, that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4 anymore, it equals 8 or 9 or 10, and you can apply that to your financial return on investment for your farm. That should be enough to encourage you to pursue diversity in your operation, because as you do, resiliency of challenging situations is going to be just improved drastically, and you'll be able to weather the harder times, and you'll be able to even take advantage of the better times with your management if you look at diversity in an operation and consider diversity. Now, good diversity can be different for different people. For somebody that's used to only growing 1 or 2 crops on their farm, diversity change might be adding a third or even a fourth crop. But if you look at nature and how nature has thrived until the industrial era, when we decided to have our impact on things, not always in the positive, it wasn't uncommon to have hundreds of different plant species in a prairie setting, for example, and they all work together and they all have their own role to play. So I just encourage people to be thinking very broadly when they're thinking about what they'd like to see in diversity in their pastures and what they might be able to strive for.
Ah, yeah, you're reminding me of a class I took in college on conservation biology. We did a lot of field trips out to local Prairieland. We were down in the southeast region of Minnesota, and we were counting species, and we would see the same common few plant species at each site, and definitely noticed that the healthier looking areas, the prairies that had been more restored, those had a much richer diversity of plant life. And then also, we would excitingly get to see some species that we hadn't come across yet. So, that said, are there any plant varieties in Minnesota in particular that could work really well on just about anybody's pasture?
So first and foremost, what can we do to change the management out there? Just changing stock density and length of recovery period between grazing events can go a long way to increasing diversity. And so first and foremost, that can be absolutely huge. There are other species we can use. Uh, Timothy, lots of seeds in a pound. A small amount of that grows on many, many soil types. It's pretty cheap. A quarter to a half pound an acre can be a cheap way to add some diversity on many sites. The clovers, particularly red clover, alfalfa, and even adding different varieties of the same species can go a long way to building diversity. Some species are going to work better on heavier soils, other better on lighter soils. We find that on heavier clay type soils, we have more opportunities on things to work with. On lighter soils, we have less stuff. Some of that's also related to pH, but it doesn't mean we can't try things. As we were talking about earlier, the changes aren't linear; they're exponential, and we find with some of these very diverse sites, there's stuff growing on it. It's like you shouldn't be growing here. This is not normal for you, and yet it's such a huge game changer and creates I guess, a more positive environment for that species that a lot of times we can see that. We're even adding now to perennial pasture mixes some of the native species that work well in a more conventional type drill for seeding them. Slender wheatgrass, switchgrass, um, intermediate wheatgrass, some of these other species, it's not very, very hard to add it. They don't have the fluffy awns on them like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass. They work in a conventional drill. They work in other mixes. We can blend those in. And so now we're adding some warm season grasses to the mix. And as we start experimenting with more of these, along with adaptive grazing to stimulate those, we could really, really get some, from our perspective, a high degree of diversity in there. We're not where we're at with native prairie. That could be done. It can be done. It's a bit expensive. Excuse me. Some of those native forbs and legumes and even some of the grasses are very, very expensive. But the ones that can work, we keep looking for those and creating opportunities to use those in perennial pasture blends to increase our diversity out there. And let's not ignore things that come in on their own. Curly dock, dandelion, even quackgrass, Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, as long as it's not dominated by that, and if we're doing a good job of managing, it shouldn't be. Even the woody species, a little bit of willow, a little bit of snowberry, a little bit of chokecherry, a little bit of serviceberry out there. That's absolutely fine because they fill an ecological niche that the more herbaceous or the more vegetative species don't fill out there, and so we can do that, and that's the beauty of things like agroforestry and silvopasture. We add that woody component to the pasture to increase that diversity to a whole nother level, and it can also be things that maybe the cattle aren't necessarily, isn't real high on their forage list, but we do it in a small amount just from a diversity standpoint for all the other benefits that can be reaped from that.
I think it's so key to understand that, different plants are going to offer so many different benefits at different times. And so, just having that availability out there again is going to provide those opportunities, and it's going to provide some buffer with, just with management and approaching when we're trying to optimize livestock performance, and you do that as in a big of a window as possible, especially when we're trying to, work with the challenges of the weather sometimes gives us. And so, make sure that we are continually making a hospitable environment for diversity, and not overdoing it on how much we take when we graze. Excessive trample, some of these other things can certainly affect that diversity. But yeah, and it just makes for such good products that come off the land.
Katie, recently Doug and I were working together on a project. It's an oak savanna restoration project at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, and we were on the ground for 5 very full days working with a group of about 100 um, stocker cattle, I guess would be the best way to call it. There's some 2-year-olds and some yearlings in the group there. And we ran these animals through some sites that I think a lot of livestock people would have really raised their eyebrows and questioned what we were doing. And yet we watched these cattle eating chokecherry, eating hazelbrush, eating aspen, eating oak leaves, along with grasses and forbs. It wasn't all they had available. They weren't locked in there all the time. We had them in there for short periods of time. But there was something about that diversity in what they had access to and they were eating that was highly attractive to them. And then they went down to a site that was heavy to reed canary grass. So we went from something high in tannins to high in alkaloids. And there's research out there suggesting that when we balance those things, animals can utilize both of them very effectively and very efficiently and balance their system out, and it can work quite well. Where if we just put them out on a pasture that was all reed canary grass that's high and it tends to be high in alkaloids, unless it's been a variety where it's been bred out of, they're not going to perform out there very well for very long. Just like if we just stuck them in the woods with just hazelbrush, they're not going to perform on that if that's all they had available. But when we offered this variety to them throughout the day and throughout the time we were there, it was very, very interesting to watch what they ate, and sometimes with great relish. We turned them out on a little peninsula under these high stock densities, and that stock density really changes their behavior on what they eat. And they were eating things that it's like you would never think they'd ever touch it. Yet there was something of value there at low amounts that was important to those animals' health and well-being.
Kent, I think it'd be important to point out too, with working with those livestock, it's not that they were put in a situation where they had to eat. These yearlings that we were working with, these stockers, they always had excellent gut fill. Animal performance was one of our key focuses in that endeavor, and so these animals willingly selected these different products, these different species of plants, and not because they had to. And it's going to make a difference, I think, too, on availability. And if these animals have had access to these types of plants before, or if it's something new and it fills a need at that time for that animal. And I just want to encourage people that are looking at integrating livestock into different scenarios, of different environments, that observation is still so important, and we can learn so much from the animals that are put on different situations and surrounded by different plant species, because as things change, we should take advantage and learn from it.
Absolutely. And I think our time there also, these are all animals that have experienced a lot of these different forages before. And just to point out that, yes, grazing to some degree is an instinctive behavior with ruminants, but it's also a learned behavior. And they learn best at the side of their mother. That learning actually begins. There's evidence that that learning actually begins in the womb before they're even born. And so a cow or a ewe that's out on diverse pasture, selecting from these different things, is beginning to transmit that knowledge, if you will, to her young. When that calf or that lamb is born, they're following mom around. They're trying things that mom's doing, and they're also observing and watching what their herd or flock mates are eating. So there is learning there. We've many of us have heard the story of the Jersey or the Holstein who's been hand fed her entire life, and all of a sudden the farmer's like, "Oh, I want to try this grazing thing," and all this cow's really gotten is corn silage, alfalfa, some soybean meal, and some mineral. Their whole life, and they're put out in a pasture, and some of those animals struggle in that situation. You would think they'd just put their head down and go to town, but some of them just stand there because you didn't cut it and bring it to them. We've trained them. Our management has trained them not to be grazers, and so if we want to use grazing again in some of these situations, we have to rebuild that in over time. But the big point is it's not only grazing's not only an innate or instinctive behavior, it's also a learned behavior. And we were at Sherburne there working with a group of cattle in that project that had been exposed to a lot of these feeds before, had learned that this is something that's okay to eat, and they took right to it. And so that's important piece of this also.
I had a chuckle, Kent, when you were talking about classical conditioning with livestock. As we just turned out some custom animals on our farm a week ago, and so these animals they've been used to being fed in a fence line situation, so they've been putting their heads through pipes, bars, petitions, whatever, to get at the feed for months. And then until we had put the electrical charger on the perimeter fence, we had about 4 of them lined up that had their heads between 2 strings of wire on the high tensile fence until we plugged it in. And they still had to go back 2 or 3 times because they didn't understand what was happening. They were waiting for somebody to roll along with the feed cart and deliver
That's
the
right.
feed.
Yes.
And it hurt a couple of times before they caught on. Well, I guess we're going to have to go find our forage someplace else.
Somewhere else. It's not between some bars or some wires.
That's right. That's right. So we can affect classical conditioning with our animals for sure, and affect things with the way we've typically been doing things without a second thought at times.
So we've talked a lot about the value of pasture plant diversity. Where could someone start if they're looking to increase theirs on their farm?
That's a great question, Katie. And I always like to think about how a farm can mimic nature. And so the first thing I always look at if I want to try to, push diversity on an operation is how can I use my grazing management to facilitate tapping into the latent seed bank? And so we always like to talk about switching things up as far as the duration of rest periods or the length of rest periods. But once we get to 80 days or more, typically, we can start tapping into latent seed bank. And when I say 80 days, I mean 80 days of recovery. And so it's also important to understand the distinguishing difference between rest and recovery. We actually have to have growing season conditions for recovery period. And so once we can stretch these grazings out a bit, and it doesn't have to be across the whole operation, it can be a portion of the operation, it can be a portion of a paddock. We can skip a paddock, for example, when we're coming through a piece. But then we're going to start to see that we're facilitating a change of an environment below those animals and in that biology to start providing the conditions for some of these seeds that have been laying there for a very, very long time to start to find the conditions that they can not only germinate but thrive. And so you can potentially see diversity coming about with less than 80 days. And I have on my own farm, but that's just kind of one of those benchmarks to consider when we're looking at the rest periods and facilitating that without looking at putting seeds in the ground that may not have the conditions fit for them to flourish. And that can be a costly situation when we're kind of guessing at the scenarios of the situation we might have with our soil conditions. So altering those grazing rest periods, recovery periods, and lengthening them out, even if it means a small portion of the farm, can go a long ways when we're trying to facilitate the increase of diversity in our plant species.
Yeah, Katie. First and foremost, what Doug just covered, we consider that paramount, and addressing those management activities are going to go a long way. If a person wants to go to the next step, and these are the things I get questions on all the time about, how can I go in and seed this stuff? And I just want to touch a little bit on some of these techniques that are out there. Frost seeding or stomp seeding. Frost seeding is when we go out and broadcast some seed late winter. Oftentimes this is done when there's snow on the ground with a broadcast seeder. This can be on the back of an ATV, the back of a tractor, or one slung around your shoulder, just walking out there. But with the snow on the ground, you can see where you spread seed as it melts. It works. Frost seeding tends to work best on our heavy clay soils during that spring thaw or that freeze thaw action during the spring. If we can do it where we're outwintering animals and an opportunity to stomp some of that seed in the ground, that can work well. I think there's some opportunity even to do it in the late fall. Our best opportunity for frost seedings, in addition to the heavy ground, is also going to be where, if we're out in our pasture and we look down and we see patches of bare ground, to help fill in those patches a little quicker, to provide some diversity. What works well in frost seeding? the clovers, red and white clover, first and foremost. Bird's foot trefoil could be an option. Timothy might be an option. I've done some frost seeding with some orchard grass out there. That seems to work pretty good. You might even be able to do a little tiny bit of switchgrass. Any of the more hard seeded type plants, it can work. Another option that's out there that's pretty kind of low tech if you're doing it anyway is if you've got pack manure that you've turned a couple times in the spring, and after the first time over grazing in, let's say, June, if you're going to go out and spread pack manure on that recently grazed paddock, take a coffee can or so full of red clover or bird's foot or white clover and throw right on top of that manure, that spreader load of manure, and spread it with that. It can be very cheap. You only need a couple pounds an acre at the very most, maybe a pound an acre. Same with the frost seeding, we only need a couple pounds an acre, but spread it out there. If that clover seed finds conditions under some of that compost or landing on a manure pat or whatever, it can take off and get established. That can provide some diversity out there. Be a little cautious on putting legumes out there. There's some evidence now that we maybe have been using legumes too much in some of our pasture mixes. A lot of our native stands only had 10 to 20% legume of the total diversity of species out there. There's a lot of recommendations out there for 30 to 50% of our stand being legume as a way to fix nitrogen. But the assumption there is that's the only place plants get nitrogen. As we have plant diversity out there and stimulate better biology, plants are getting nitrogen through that system also. I'm not going to wade deep in the weeds and all the technicals of that right now, but uh, there's some we have a tendency to overuse or overplay the nitrogen card, I think, and that can be to the detriment of our soil biology. The last thing I want to talk about is no-tilling something in, and I get asked this a lot on using a no-till drill. And there's some things we're seeing over time from experience that to determine if this is going to work or not. Again, are we seeing a thin stand out there? Is there a lot of bare ground? We're going to need to stress the existing stand in order to do that. And we need to think about this a year in advance. A lot of people call me in April or March and say, I got a weak stand out there. I want to no-till something in it. I think it's too late. And I'm speaking from experience and from the experience of others. If we just stress this stand in the spring, it's not enough. If we try to no-till another little seed into an existing stand of forage that's out there, it just can't compete. The first rain, the first fertility, the first sunlight that hits that established plant is just going to roar right past that little seedling. It's just not going to be able to compete for light, moisture, and nutrients. We need to stress that stand the fall before and again in the spring. We need to stress it at least twice on both ends of the season. And that's something people miss. I've seen too many situations where we've only stressed it in the spring, the seed was put in the ground, and very little of it was seen. Unless there's a huge amount of bare ground out there, then we have a lot bigger problems out there. The only place I can think of where it might work best is if we're turning an old alfalfa hayfield into a pasture and we want to introduce some diversity and we have very low alfalfa stem densities out there. So there's some opportunity there. Also, the type of seeder we use. There's some indications that a T-slot no-till drill creates a better seed bed and better opportunity for integrating other species in there versus a slot type no-till drill. It just creates a better opportunity. Again, we still have to stress that existing stand for any hope of this happening. It's not a cheap thing to do. You got machinery costs, you got seed costs, you got fuel costs, you got labor costs, and yet a lot of people continually want to jump to that. Again, we encourage folks to go back to what Doug talked about, altering that animal management, managing the rest periods out there, managing stock densities. You can see a lot of benefits there without dropping a lot of money.
I guess one thing I'd add too is that the cheapest spreaders you've got out there or seeders are the cattle or the livestock themselves. And so I know a number of producers now that are mixing seeds right with minerals, and have been really surprised at some of the results that they've had, and not just having plant populations where cow pies might land, but actually fairly well distributed across a pasture. And so, some of the legumes and some of the grasses, not necessarily a cereal, but some of these small seeded things that, the digestive tract of livestock doesn't kill them all. And so, for very little investment, you could do some experimentation that way if you're interested.
Yeah, I really, really want to reinforce the seed being not treated. When you're going to run it through your animals, that's just important for animal health. Another option would be buying some quality dry hay that was put up a little more mature, particularly if it's got orchard grass, alfalfa, red and white clover in it. If there's viable seed in there, bale grazing or unrolling bales on a site is another way to introduce some diversity out on that site. I've seen it numerous times where those species can get started out there and add some diversity to the stand just by bale grazing some hay that was put up at a more mature state.
Yeah, absolutely, Kent. And some of these situations where we've got restrictions on when hay could be made on some acres can really fit in well, whether it be maybe road ditches or maybe a government-owned land that allows haymaking certain times of year, or even certain programs where it may not be considered the optimum nutritional time from a hay perspective, but taking advantage of those opportunities to selectively harvest that crop for that purpose of just diversity. Because some plants that are growing in those conditions are extremely hardy, and the best of what you want to select from when you're trying to introduce those seeds into a new environment.
Well, that's plenty of food for thought for folks to start increasing plant diversity in their pastures. Thanks, guys. Always learn a lot from you.
You're welcome, Kitty.
Thanks.
Good to be with you.
Dirt Rich is produced by the Sustainable Farming Association. We believe that agriculture, done well, heals. For more resources or to tap into the Farmer to Farmer Network, visit us at sfa-mn.org. Oh, I just blanked. What was the... Okay, yes.
Woohoo!